Good evening. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy, and I'm the facilitator for the Open Classroom, which meets every Wednesday night to discuss issues of public policy. We're delighted to be able to draw upon colleagues and friends both within Northeastern University and outside of it. And we're starting this semester with what I think will be an absolutely fascinating series of conversations about how design can influence public policy, how it influences spaces, how it brings people together, how it shapes communities. And we're going to be working this semester with Anne-Marie Lupinow of the Bruner Foundation, and we're going to be sharing a number of projects that have been Bruner Award winners in recent years, particularly as they impact on urban communities. But it's also the case tonight that we are culminating a rather extraordinary day in American history. We are transitioning from one administration to another. That is not extraordinary in and of itself within the democracy that we've built, but we're doing this transitioning at a point in time where there's been exceptional turmoil that has taken place since our last meeting, only 6 or 7 weeks ago. And so before we start to talk about design and some of the opportunities that exist around that, I've invited two of my colleagues from the Northeastern Law School, Jeremy Paul, who has served as the dean there, and Dan Ehrman. We've worked together. Those of you who are regulars with the Open Classroom will certainly recognize them from previous classes. If you're new to the Open Classroom, I just remind folks that these sessions are recorded. You'll be able to view them in our archives within another couple of days. We create opportunities for exchange of ideas, and if you have questions or comments, please pass them on to us through the chat function on your screens. And the other thing I'll just say as a reminder is that this is a safe space. We encourage you to openly and freely express your ideas. So before we get into design, I'm going to look to Jeremy and to Dan to just give us some comments about the transition that we've just been through and your expectations of what it is that's to come, particularly in legal areas, but also in practical areas as we move forward with a new administration in Washington. So who wants to begin? Dan, I see that you're unmuted, so maybe we'll start with you, and Jeremy, if you'll unmute yourself, you can jump in as you see fit. Dan?
Thank you so much, Ted, and Happy New Year to everyone. Um, just to sort of start where Ted mentioned that we talked about the rule of law. Uh, 3 years ago, this January, it was spring of 18, and I'm still adjusting to the fact that it's 2021. One of the things that marks the rule of law, it's hard to define. We spent a few weeks working on it. But one of them that kind of everyone agrees is the peaceful transfer of power. So in many ways, today represented this longest functioning democracy. And if you hadn't been paying attention to politics, thought everything today was pretty normal. But then in other ways, you just have to go back a few weeks, which they did allude to today, and think about what happened and how close we really were to something that could have been much, much worse. Those things are not going to go away. Some of the underlying issues we have in America, including white supremacy, the use of violence to settle disputes, those things are not going away. But Joe Biden has a lot of goodwill. I think there are a lot of people, Ted, that are looking forward to making politics boring again, right? So that not everyone is consumed by politics. But I don't want to underestimate challenging the road is ahead. One thing, I just want to make a couple comments on what I saw today, and then I want to hear what Jeremy says, and I hope Jeremy will disagree with me like he sometimes does. Um, the first was, it was striking just to see the representation, the diversity on the stage. It was a contrast from the Trump era to see the Biden and Harris family. I thought that the poet laureate was by far the best speaker by a mile today. I was very, very impressed and moved. But then at the same time, or soon thereafter, you had the swearing in of an African American minister from Georgia who was on Dr. King's pulpit, and a Jewish millennial who I think is the senior most millennial in government, John Ossoff, and the first Jewish Senate Majority Leader. So what I'm saying is that, you know, I'll quote Bill Clinton, you know, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what is right with America. So it was really striking to see that. But I guess my larger point is, I don't want to underestimate Biden's challenges, both domestic and foreign, but it was a hopeful and an uplifting day. And it was nice to hear him say, I'm your president, whether you voted for me or not. So I'll leave it there, and I would love to hear what Jeremy thinks.
Thanks, Dan. And for those of you who I see are joining just a little bit late, we will be having a discussion about design and about Bruner Foundation award winners, and we'll be hearing from Anne-Marie Lubenow and Carolyn Crockett. But that'll just be in a couple of minutes. We have brought together just a couple of Northeastern faculty from the law school and our journalism program for a couple of comments on what happened earlier today, what has happened recently, and what they anticipate moving forward. Jeremy, as past dean of the law school, your comments?
Well, thank you very much, Ted, for inviting me to this. I'm proud to be participating in the open classroom. I think this is one of our wonderful innovations, and you're doing a great job leading it. I think your choice of design as the topic for the semester is an excellent one, and I look forward to trying to sit in when I can. So quite honestly, watching Joe Biden's inauguration speech today was really one of the happiest moments of my whole life. I feel as though the country seriously dodged a bullet. And I say that not for partisan reasons, meaning that I prefer Democratic policies to Republican policies, although often I do, but because I think that no country really can survive if it's not governed, at least first and foremost, by the idea that facts matter and truth matters. And for the last 4 years, we have witnessed relentless attacks on the press, a truly shameless president who will lie about big things, lie about little things, pretty much lie about everything, to the point where it was no longer a question of whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, but whether you believed in the principles of the United States since its founding, or whether you did not. And I feel as though we have dodged a bullet and restored some hope for trajectory. Now, Dan, I don't disagree with you at all that there's a lot still ahead. And in fact, it was wonderful to see the diversity. I think one thing you did not mention was, in addition to the 2 senators from Georgia, Kamala Harris's Senate replacement is the first Latinx senator from California. That's a further progress. But unfortunately, what was looming ahead of us almost immediately, which is the trial of now former President Trump, is going to make it very difficult for now President Biden to move forward with what he clearly made the theme of today's speech, right? Namely, that we should try to unify the country. I loved what he said. We just need to bring enough of us along, and then enough of us will carry the rest of us. I thought that was a very nice way for him to put the call to unity. But it's going to be very difficult to start his presidency when there's no question but that the big news, right, the thing that's going to be attracting everyone's attention right off the bat is going to be the trial of President Trump. I don't see how it can be avoided. I think that the events at the Capitol and Trump's role in encouraging them, mostly, and again, this goes back to my main theme about lying. You could debate all you want about whether his comments on the day of the Capitol riots or the Capitol insurrection or whatever we will call it, were crossed the line to incitement. But there's no question that he just continued to lie over and over again about the election results, right? He's still saying we won in a landslide, right? Well, presidents should not be able to get away with lying to the public in a way that leads to the kind of thing that we saw at the Capitol. So, one of the reasons why I consider myself a friend of the open classroom is that what TED has done with it, and what I think the university has done with it, is it's a forum where everyone's entitled to his, her, or their own opinion, but not everyone's entitled to our own facts. And if we're going to have unity, we don't want conformity or a monolith in the country. In fact, we never get anywhere if we didn't have disagreements. But our starting point has to be, I'm going to listen to you. You're going to cite your evidence. You're going to listen to me, right? I'll cite my evidence. And at the end of the day, what we're going to agree on is that the person with the best evidence wins, not the person with the loudest voice, and most certainly not the people with guns. When I say we dodged a bullet, that's what we dodged. We dodged the slide into the people with the guns are the ones who win. But there's still a lot of people out there with guns. And I'm actually very heartened to see that after the Capitol event, the people with the guns seem to have just evaporated. There was almost no protests today. I think that it may turn out to be the case that many of Trump's supporters preferred his policies to Biden's, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but now are perfectly prepared to go along and try to give Biden a chance, and that the kind of fervor that led to the Capitol riot will tone down for a while. But it's always there, and it's going to be a challenge for all of us. And one of the things I think is really important is not to lump all of Trump's supporters together. I think that that's a terrible thing. I think you see it in comedy. I think you see it on Twitter. I think everywhere when people are gleeful about the transition of power, it's great to be gleeful about the restoration of truth. It's not great to be gleeful about the pain that the people who voted for Trump are feeling because their guy lost, right? Because ultimately, and I'll stop with this, I want to be in a country and South Carolina. The idea that we're going to have a split country, that's not where we want to go. Right after we did that course, Dan, in the spring of 18, in the fall of 18, my wife and I drove across country and back. And we found joy in places we never even dreamed of ever going to. And the idea that somehow or other there's good parts of the country, like flyover country, forget it, red states, blue states, all the stuff that Obama said, we got to get back to that, because otherwise, to the extent that it will be in some politicians' interests to accentuate those divisions, to try again to disrupt our democracy, we got to be prepared for that. And the best way to be prepared is to value the truth. And that's why I'm so happy to be at the Open Classroom. And Ted, I thank you for including me.
Thank you. And for a final comment, we've been joined happily by Jonathan Kaufman, who heads our journalism program. Jonathan's been under attack, of course, from Washington for quite some time, and he's brought a tremendous amount of truth to our conversation. So for a final comment before we embark on our semester of design thinking, Jonathan, what can you say about what has happened? Unmute yourself, please. And what do you see lying ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the sober, skeptical journalist here. I think there's going to be an era of good feeling that'll probably last 48 hours. I think if you follow the media coverage right now, everyone thinks this was a great inauguration. It went off seamlessly. And it's kind of a kumbaya moment. I think probably within a couple of days, or certainly in a couple of weeks, we're going to start reading stories about, problems in the vaccine rollout, problems Biden is having, Kamala Harris unhappy with her role. I mean, this is what the media does, and it's part of our role. I think, though, there are three long-term changes that were unleashed by Trump that we can't forget about, even when we're feeling good about today. One is that Fox News is still there. I think there was this belief, perhaps, that Fox was going to kind of change its spots, and they said that Biden had won Arizona and that they maybe were appalled by what happened at the Capitol. Well, the fact is, Fox has now started a purge of its newsroom. The news people who oversaw that call of Arizona have been fired. They're probably going to bring in more right-wing hosts. And Rupert Murdoch has an unerring eye for what sells. And so we now see even more extreme right-wing outlets developing, like OAN and Newsmax and so forth. But the phenomenon of people getting their news in their own bubble is going to continue. That's not going to go away. And it's going to make this sort of coming together that I think Dan and Jeremy and I all hope for very difficult. I thought it was interesting in his speech when Biden said, it doesn't matter what religion we have or what our race is or where we get our news. We all have to come together. And I think that was important. The second thing is, I think in the newspapers that many of us read and rely on, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, there has been under Trump this move towards being more definitive, to basically take a side, to call Trump out. But I think for many people, and not necessarily the Trump loyalists who stormed the Capitol, but the 10, 15, 20% of people who have seemed to have moved between Trump and the Democrats and, the kind of reasonable Republicans, this belief that the major news outlets, I'd include NPR in that and CNN, are becoming more and more liberal. They're embracing a liberal identity. They now have an economic model which relies on readers, subscribers, not on advertising. And when your readers are demanding something, you tend to give it to them. And so I think this is going to be a problem that places that we look for to establish facts, to have a common dialogue, are going to be held in suspicion by a lot of Americans. Even our own students are running into increasing hostility when they go out and do stories where people calling them fake news and so forth. So I think that's going to continue. And the third thing is, and this is something I think the country really has to think about, is that following what happened in the Capitol, there was this deplatforming that took place. Parler was taken off, people were kicked off Twitter. Now, those people are not going away, and they haven't gone away. They've found other apps, other places to go, and already you're hearing from the FBI and others that it's become harder to track a lot of these right-wing movements, because when they were on Parler or putting their selfies carrying out Nancy Pelosi's lectern, you could find out who they were and identify them. And so I think we have to be careful that in this kind of day of good feeling, the people who are opposed to this and even violently opposed to it have been driven underground. And the kind of purification of Twitter and these other platforms, while it may make us seem a country that's maybe regained its senses, may just mean that we've driven it underground. And we're going to have to figure out a way to both give people who are opposed to what's going on an outlet, but also to give the government and police tools to pursue these folks because they're not out taking selfies all the time. So, but I think the open classroom, as Jeremy says, is just a great forum for what we want a university to be and a country to be. And I think you're going to have a great semester.
Great. Gentlemen, thank you for your comments. They are, as ever, thoughtful and provocative. And I appreciate you joining us on this extraordinary day. And now I want to turn the call over to my colleague, Anne-Marie Lubenow of the Bruner Foundation. We've worked together for many years on design issues around the country. She has invited Carolyn Crockett to share with us thoughts about design and community. And so Anne-Marie, you're on. And I remind everyone, you have an opportunity to raise questions or to make comments. Please use the chat box, and we will get to as many questions and comments as we can in the rest of our time together tonight. Anne-Marie, you're on.
Thank you, Ted, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting the Bruner Foundation and me to be a part of the 2021 Myra Craft Open Classroom series. We're really honored. I'm Anne-Marie Lubenow. I'm the director of the Rudy Bruner Award for Urban Excellence at the Bruner Foundation in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the Rudy Bruner Award is a national urban design award that recognizes transformative places that contribute to the economic, environmental, and social vitality of American cities. At today's inauguration, President Biden inspired us to write the next great chapter of the American story. He asked, what shall be our legacy? What is the story that guides and inspires us to meet the present moment? Similarly, the inaugural poet, Amanda Gorman, challenged us to move forward with purpose. I have to say those words echoed conversations I've had with Ted Landsmark over recent months as we discussed the curation of this series. It's clear that the events of the past year will have deep and lasting consequences for every aspect of our society, including the buildings, places, neighborhoods, and cities we inhabit. So we begin the series in the year with a new presidential administration with a new agenda, as well as a society tentatively looking forward to a post-COVID world. So how do we move forward with purpose? What are the stories that will guide and inspire us? With that in mind, we've tapped into our Rudy Bruner network of 88 award-winning places and people we know engaged in architecture and urban design, planning and development, education and community engagement, and public policy and civic leadership from across the country. Over the course of the series, we'll explore how cities across America are addressing issues like equity, racial justice, and resilience. We'll tackle topics like arts and culture, education and food, housing, infrastructure and innovation, parks and public spaces, and how we engage and empower our communities. We'll share the stories of people and places engaged in innovative urban development and consider how we might apply what we learned to our own work, both here in Boston and in other cities. We'll post a page about each session on our Rudy Bruner Award website with links to resources, including information and case studies about people and projects that you can turn to after the event to learn more. So we're beginning our series by exploring the question of how do we create beautiful, just, and resilient places with Dr. Carolyn Crockett. Dr. Crockett is the City of Boston's first Chief of Equity, a new cabinet level position created by Mayor Walsh to embed equity and racial justice into all city planning, operations, and work moving forward. She brings to the role an extensive background in urban studies and planning as a lecturer at MIT, Director of Economic Policy and Research, and Director of Small Business Development at the City of Boston. She's also an author. She's the author of People Before Highways, Boston Activists, Urban Planners, and a New Movement for City Making, which chronicles the story of a citizen-led movement that prevented the construction of highways through the heart of Boston and led to the creation of Southwest Corridor, a 1989 Rudy Bruner Award silver medalist with lasting impacts on our city. I can't think of a better person to help us kick off the series and the conversation, and I'm so thrilled that she could be with us. Carolyn?
Anne-Marie, thank you so much for such a warm and wonderful introduction. It is fantastic to be here in the open classroom and to be with you and Ed as you guys continue to do what you do, which is make good trouble, which is what John Lewis told us that we have to be all about. So, I really appreciate the chance to be in conversation on such a historic and momentous day. I think, like many of you all, spent the middle of the day looking at all of the events in Washington and watching this moment of the transfer of power and really thinking about the ways that our democracy has been tested and challenged, not just over these last 4 years plus, but also even in the last week. And so I feel like, if anything, today is bringing us into consciousness, bringing us into power, and bringing us deeper into our commitment to understanding why it is that we need to be about making places just, making places inclusive, and making sure we have a clear-eyed understanding of what equity is. So very, very happy to be here today as the Chief of Equity for the City of Boston. I come to you bringing greetings from City Hall, even as City Hall itself is in transition. We had a wonderful opportunity to see where Mayor Walsh was seated there in the Capitol. He had a plum seat. We were very proud, and we're really proud of all the work that he will do as Labor Secretary. And so, here I just prepared a few remarks, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and the opportunity to be in discussion about this very big question. And so, in listening to some of what Jeremy and Jonathan and even some of Dan's earlier comments, what the conversation was earlier, I think this real discussion about what does it mean to come together to express our highest dreams, our highest intentions for ourselves as folks who are living in a pluralist democracy is always the question that is at hand. And so when we think about how this session has been framed, which is a discussion of a question, as Anne-Marie underscored, how do we create beautiful, just, and resilient places? I think when we think about a question like that, we have to ask ourselves, for whom? And so in asking that question, it brings us into a deeper consideration of, again, whose power, whose interests, and whose intentions are considered, are prioritized. So what I wanted to do is I'll talk a little bit more about my role. I'll talk a little bit about this work I have done to surface this Boston anti-highway fight story that led to the creation of the Southwest Corridor Park, which absolutely has the distinction of being a 1989 Bruner Award winner. And so for me, this has been about a path of discovery, and I'm still in it. I am homegrown, a Boston kid, a Dorchester kid, Dorchester as the biggest neighborhood, the best neighborhood, the most diverse neighborhood, all that. I got to give you a little boost up. And so what it has meant for me to grow up in the city of Boston and to realize all of the city's beauty and opportunity in all of its deepest challenges. The beauty of the sea, which I love. Growing up in Dorchester, I claim the sea as my own. I claim all of the city's open spaces and parks and Franklin Park and trees and all these things. And also being very aware of the city's challenges, our deep racial cleavages, our deep economic challenges. Those definitely, all of these things shape the person that I grew up to be, and has absolutely established my career path, which is someone who's very dedicated to understanding how can we pull ourselves more fully into who we are meant to be. And certainly when Mayor Walsh reached out to me about 7 months ago, thinking about this role of Chief of Equity, I had no idea what this was. I was in my, at home, at the kitchen sink, washing dishes. It was about 9 o'clock, the phone rings, and it's the mayor. I wanted to know how he got my phone number. That was like a first question. And then I said, I guess he's the mayor, he has ways. But I honestly asked him, what is this conversation about equity? And what is it that you have in mind? And we immediately started to discuss George Floyd's murder. And he talked about the way that the death of this man, the murder of this man in plain sight, had very much challenged how he thought about himself as mayor and what it meant to lead a city, what it meant to be a mayor and what it meant to be a white mayor, really thinking hard about racial justice, really thinking hard about economic inclusion and opportunity and healthy outcomes. And the question he put to me was, what more can we do? How can we stretch the bounds of City Hall? How can we think about the mayor's office as an opportunity to bring us closer to equity and a higher understanding of healing and opportunity? So I sat down, I stepped away from the sink, I left the dishes there and sat down in this conversation to try to dream something more than we had even imagined at that time. And so the discussion was, what could this agenda be about? And what would it mean to really think through the city's economic agenda, the city's health agenda, and a more inclusive vision of what Boston could be not only in this year, but in the next generation. And so over this time has really been a steady discussion of this charge of embedding equity into the city's processes, into its plan, into its plans, and into its everyday practices. So a very lofty charge, but one that is very much informed by not only the mayor's commitment, but a sense of what history can be. So what I bring to this role is an understanding of the city's history, a commitment to public policy, and a sense of what it means to govern a city. And so look forward to talking a little bit more about this role in particular, but wanted to just offer that because in sitting at MIT for the last couple of years where I have been teaching policy and history, I have been really astounded by how we think about space and design as someone who sits inside of a school of architecture, and how too often history is not brought to our understanding of space or design. And so what I offer you is an opportunity to think about design as a way to think about what you want to see. Very simply put, how do you express what you want to see in a set of intentions? And trying to think about what I have been able to learn about this from history. So I do have a couple slides here to frame us up. Can I share my screen? Will that work?
Yes, you should be good to go.
Okay, great. So let's try that. You can see that fine? Great, okay. So this is the central question and consideration for us. And as I was thinking about the sort of question about social history and roads, which has become a little bit of an expert area, I suppose, is this question about highways, highway growth, and certainly bringing us back to the story of this anti-highway movement of the 1960s. So when I think about some of these books, my little book there, People Before Highways, is sort of in the company of many folks who have been thinking about not only space and design and highways as an expression of design and intention, but also the ways that roads have been a segregating vector. So the ways that race and class and economics have been bound up into what is a very interesting material history of road building. And so I think about the moment of the Brown versus the Board of Education, this decision. You see marked there by Thurgood Marshall and his friends, sort of celebrating this very, very exciting decision of Brown, and then what that meant for what would be not only the refutation of separate but equal, but would actually set us on the course for this incredibly important high water mark around civil rights and all the movements that ensued. So really trying to think about that in the face of the Federal Aid Highway Act signed by Eisenhower in '56. And so a moment where you have Brown, again, dismantling this idea of separate but equal, and really pushing us toward a discussion about racial integration. Right after that, the signing of the Federal Aid Highway Act, which the creation of this federal highway system, more than 44,000 miles of roads, would actually create a very physical material expression of connectivity through asphalt and roads, but at the same time would give us the consequence of deep, deep separation, deep, deep segregation of space, time, and community. So what does it mean to imagine these very different sets of policies and laws converging to create us feeling a sense of torque? The country sort of, in theory, being connected, but actually being torn apart at the same time. So this is part of what I wound up arguing through this study. And so there were many places around the country marked by these little yellow X's that are a little bit cute here, but are showing us places where highway revolts broke out, where cities really came together to protest the idea of the expanded interstate system. You see a little yellow X there in Boston, but what's important is to point out that there were X's in other places, and certainly in San Francisco along the Embarcadero, where one of the nation's first highway revolts broke out. So just as folks were celebrating the idea of the highways as the future, as progress, many people on the ground still smarting themselves from urban renewal and other kind of economic devastations in the city were saying, no, not us. And so here in Boston, we have an opportunity to think about what the impact of that road could have been. And here in front of you is showing basically a schematic of the road. And so the dotted lines are showing you what would have been this interstate road system. An extension of I-95, the dotted lines are showing you what would have been the alignment going north up through Peabody, going south all the way down to the west through Canton and Norwood. And though a lot of the time there was this conversation about where would this alignment be. And so for those of you that may have been there during this time and can remember this conversation, it was powerful, because you're coming at a time where in the country you have support, as you had seen of the previous slide, of the President Eisenhower. You had support coming through here, the support of the governor, support of many of the local officials, including the mayor at the time, people saying this is a done deal. And so when clearance began in 1966 in Boston, the question was, how could you possibly stop this inevitable behemoth, which everyone is in support of, which again is supposed to herald progress, which is supposed to be the way forward, offering 90 cents on the dollar's worth of financing at a time where the city was growing, but at losing money in terms of its tax base and looking for a way to bring dollars to the city. And so looking at this and looking at this alignment even on your right to see what that would mean for Boston, the conversation initially among activists and folks on the ground was not should there be a highway or whether there should or should not be a highway, but where this highway might be placed. And so although we talk about this as an anti-highway movement that was really about stopping a road, initially it was not. And so some of these alignments here are giving you a sense of what were some of the debates about where the road could go. There's a bigger story here to tell, but I just want to give you a little bit of a teaser for your eye. And so this harkens back for many folks that I interviewed about what their views were in the 1960s and what they thought about this road. Folks talked quite a lot about a previous project, a previous urban renewal clearance project, which as many of you know was the West End. And so although the big interstate highway expansion is in the 1960s moment, an earlier clearance in the 50s is telling us a different story. Many of you know this cautionary story of the West End. And I was amazed by not only the devastation of the story, which many of us know, basically 15,000 to 20,000 people displaced. There's some density here, and in that slide on the right showing you that kind of smear of dirt where all those families were displaced from. Of course, the West End becomes the textbook story of what not to do in terms of development, but this was legal. This was what progress in the name of urban renewal looked like at the time. But what is amazing to me about this story is the trauma that it resulted in terms of people's consciousness about what it means for the city of Boston and even the state to be engaged in development. Many folks who either experienced the West End clearance directly or were witnessing it said never again, said this is not the way that we want to participate in development. This is definitely an overreach of government. And so when it came to mobilizing in terms of the highway fight, and I can share some of that too, is that people were saying the West End taught us something, that not only is this not the way forward and not okay, but if the city or the state or the federal government try again to clear us, to push us off our land, we'll have a very different approach, a very different response, and we're organized and getting ready for that. And so here we're fast forwarding ourselves to slightly after this 1960s moment where on the alignment between Roxbury and JP, you can see the standpipe there on Fort Hill in the distance. And people are standing on land that had been cleared, getting ready for some of the highways expansion, coming here on the edge of Roxbury and JP, people who actually have taken what was empty land and turning it here into an urban farm. This is a horticulture class that is assembling, and people are thinking about how to repurpose, again, empty space and make it useful for them through vegetation, through gardening. What's striking to me about this image is actually these, you can see the telephone lines that are there. And so it's reminding us that this had been a densely settled residential area. And this is giving you a sense of some of the clearance and emptiness that resulted in the aftermath of clearing for the highway, and how folks who were still in this area in Roxbury and JP are finding themselves in this sort of hanging balance between there is no highway, it's clear, they're not sure what's to come, but there's land that can be used and reimagined and repurposed, and that's what the neighbors there are doing. And so in much of this story, with the Department of Public Works and state highway planners trying to think through where these roads would go, you'd get an image like this that just kind of showed you these kind of spaghetti pieces of lines hanging out on a map to show you, all right, this could be Route 128, this could be the inner belt here, just giving you a sense of what these roads may look like, a simple schema. But again, as I had mentioned earlier, the idea that design is giving you a sense of intention, a sense of desire, a sense of possibility. What this map disguises is who would be impacted, who would be affected by this kind of a rendering, and what it would mean for people who lived in the city and certainly who lived in the highway's path. And so early on, a committee comes together of folks who would be known as, even at the time, as radical planners, as folks who were thinking about what alternatives could be, come together and start to look at some of these maps and say, well, why don't we look at these at the street level? And so in that comes together Fred Salvucci, who I know many of us know, Tunny Lee, Dennis Blackett, and others who were local people who were trained in thinking about planning, thinking about what this means in terms of space, spatial planning analysis, and offered up to the public these kinds of street level renderings that would show the highway's alignment, and in that very powerful way starts to make clear for folks what could be at stake for them. And so automatically an image that had existed, as I had shown on the previous slide, of kind of spaghetti strings floating in space, come down to a much more granular level of a street scale. And all of a sudden you look at a map like this that shows a Vassar Street or Mass Ave or any number of streets, and you might say to yourself, wait a minute, that's my house, or that's my school, or that's my child's playground. And in this very powerful and very simple way, people begin to prick public consciousness into saying, we have a problem here. There's not just this abstracted notion of progress, abstracted notion of travel efficiencies, but now we're talking about a plan that may not only have a negative impact on me and my community, but may actually displace me and my family. And so just at the moment where this movement really starts to come into focus, on the right-hand side, basically you have two archival images here from the globe. On the right-hand side, many people assembled in front of the State House steps in January 25th, 1969, really bringing right to the front steps of government and to the governor, saying, no, we're not in support. We do not support this idea of a road. You need to reconsider what that is. A few months prior to that, similarly, folks showed up on the State House steps. That's on your left-hand side image. Folks who were demonstrating to show that not only were they not pleased with the city's response to the assassination of Dr. King, but they wanted to come and bring a peaceful vigil and showed their defiance through this very simple sign. You can see here, Black is beautiful. That seems very simple, but it's politically at that time very powerful. This is just a few days after Dr. King's assassination in 1968. The words Black is beautiful, a very forceful political rallying call, not Negro, not colored, but Black, and to assemble and to make that sign on the steps of the Massachusetts State House, really speaking to a new kind of politics that was emerging. And so on the screen in front of you, you have two different kinds of social movements. You have the social movement to stop the highway and can assert a new kind of vision that is participatory, that is regional, that is not autocentric. On the other side, you have the bubbling up of the Black Power movement, of the Civil Rights movement, among a younger generation of folks who are asserting themselves in the front, basically at the seat of government. And what I'm arguing here is an opportunity for us as people who think about space and time and power to think about the convergence of several sets of social movements and what that meant for us in the 1960s and the implications of that for the 1970s and design that we would come to consider even in the 1980s. And so there's a cross-fertilization that is worth paying some attention to. Here is another image of that same day, January 25th, 1969, People Before Highways Day, where this incredible regional coalition comes together again to confront Governor Sargent, who you see there on the right, to really express their dissatisfaction with the plan, but again, as I'm arguing, to express their intent. And their intent was to imagine a new kind of city that was really mindful of the people who were living there and saw the people who were living in the city as planners, as designers, as experts, able to create new kinds of realities and plans for themselves, not just in a far distant future, but for now. And so very powerful to see this kind of an assortment of folks, not just as protesters, but as theorists, as planners, as designers themselves in an early stage of fermenting a plan that they would press before and to the governor. And so this is some of the backstory, and I'm almost done here so we can come to Q&A, which is some of the way that I was collecting reflections from people who were who were involved in this movement in the 60s. So I used a lot of social media, through Facebook, through lots of emails and conversations to try to get people's reflections on their stories. And one of the things I was trying to track down was some of the different ways that people were using that cleared land. There was an earlier slide I showed you of folks doing some urban gardening on space that was cleared. So from 1966 through the later part of the 60s and 70s, when this land, before it would become the Southwest Corridor Park, a lot of this land was empty. One of the uses that was very fascinating to me that I found out through conversations and some interviews was that the Black Panthers had put a trailer on this land. And I had interviewed several people and had many notable conversations, even with Ken Kruckemeyer, that some of you know, I think is on the call tonight, to try to find this image of the Black Panther trailer. And so the Black United Front was a Black radical group that had set up an information center on the corridor, and the Black Panthers then set up this health center on the corridor. This is noteworthy, again, back to this point of design being an expression of intention, and the way the communities were saying, we don't want a highway. We have ideas for how this land could be used. It could be used as an information center to let us know what's going on in the neighborhood, in the city. It could be used as a health center to let us get some of the critical services that we need that we're not getting from the existing health establishment. And so after many conversations and meetings, I kept trying to find this image of this trailer. And so if you read the book, you'll hear me and you'll see me looking for this image, which I never found. The book was published in 2018. And luckily I had a chance to have many, many talks. And in the midst of one of these public talks, someone in the crowd says, I have this image. the Black Panther trailer, I have this here. And so this image comes from Armani White, a resident organizer in the city, and it makes me feel like I can now present back this image, which is pretty amazing because in many of my conversations with folks, they talked about the fact that there was this white trailer on the corridor, and I couldn't find the paper trail. I couldn't find it in newspapers. I couldn't find anything, but I knew that it sat very, it loomed very large in the public imagination. As a historian, the challenge was to trust that and to understand there was this desire for this story, but that it was real. And so I did write about it without the paper trail that many of my advisors would have preferred, but as an example of the community's visioning for itself, this idea that there were a set of designs and principles that were to be brought into space, the idea that there were there's a convergence of movements that were redefining what space could be even before the corridor existed. This is a very profound story and evidence of that. Last couple slides here. Similarly, right on that land, the Black Panthers a trailer was right there on sort of this corner of Ruggles and Tremont, which would later be transformed into Ruggles Station. So we know the story of this incredible process led by Stella Lee and David Lee in terms of reimagining what this amazing sort of MBTA space could be as a station, but also thinking about what that would mean for a new public transit line. And so I'll stop here. These are just some renderings of what the not only the design of the corridor could be, but also thinking about what that meant for imagining this new train line that would come through a cutout space that had earlier railroad activity in there. But what's fascinating to me about these renderings and even looking at some of these older works, these archives, was the way that lots and lots of conversations that were led through a much larger community participation process led by Tony Pangaro, led by Ken Kruckemeyer, led by so many others who were involved in making sure this community's desires of neighbors along the road could be transferred and transformed into plans, into standards that would allow for what people did want and did need to be expressed in the material form. And so this is the story for us as we think about not only the fact that the anti-highway fight led to ending this preoccupation with road building, which would have been disastrous for us in the city, offering this 10 to 12 lane road you see on the left with 160,000 cars pouring through the heart of the city, what it meant for people to come together and stop that and refute that, and not only refute it, but to say, we don't want that. In fact, we want this other thing. For us right now, the question of how do we create very robust public participation processes that lead us to a higher understanding of what people want and need, and how can we use principles of equity that involve procedural equity in terms of processes that allow for an understanding of who should be prioritized based on their needs, based on walkability, on nearness, based on mobility, based on just fairness in terms of resourcing. These are the questions that led to this incredible result and this incredible victory, but they're not questions that have a historic expiration date. These are the kinds of stories and the kind of lessons that have to stay with us absolutely to this day. And so when I come into City Hall each day and I think about this work, it is very much informed by stories like this, cautionary stories about how government can think of itself as benevolent, can think of itself as all-knowing, and we know that that is always a conceit. Unless there is a real way to engage in much broader, not only conversation, but participations and community, then there is no way that we can imagine what the future is, no matter how fancy our drafting boards are or how excited we are about architectural education. There has to be a check in there. And for me, that check is absolutely through these kinds of robust participatory processes. So I'll stop there and look forward to any kind of conversation that we could have.
Well, thanks. That was a terrific and comprehensive presentation. We have a number of interrelated questions which you and others can address. Who was the highway intended to serve in the first place? Why did anyone think that this was a particularly good idea?
Exactly. Yeah, and this was a sort of it's a controversial point there, Ted, because so much of the highway's benefit was for people who were living outside of the city. And highway economics at the time seemed to very clearly prioritize suburban drivers and suburban car owners. And so this question was put to folks to say, well, how many people in the city actually own cars? And if we think about who it is outside of the city, sorry, that own cars, it prioritized what we saw as white, suburban, heterosexual male families. And so even in saying that this was meant to be a public investment or something that was for the public good, within this kind of a plan, there was very much a privileging of a very particular elite, a minority that was disproportionately benefited from this kind of federal financing. And so a problem. And so people in the city saying, well, what we actually need is not a road. What we actually need is more housing. What we actually need is better open space and public transit. And so their organizing really made those points clear when this other kind of plan did anything but.
You know, I always note that Northeastern itself was a major beneficiary of stopping the road because if a major highway had gone through the corridor that was intended, then the expansion of the Orange Line, relocation of the Orange Line, and the development of a new commuter rail station at Ruggles probably would not have happened. That new road and the station helped to establish a parameter for Northeastern, but also enabled the campus to begin to better serve a wider range of people throughout the region because of the commuter rail station.
Which is a great point, especially knowing what we know from the archive that shows us that Northeastern was an institution that was opposed to the station and was really very hesitant to think that there could be a benefit directly to the university or the campus based on this openness. And so some of those earlier meetings are really revealing in terms of what President Ryder had in mind and others who seemed that they were not really kind of thinking that this could be a way for the future. So you're exactly right to point out all the ways that Northeastern has now benefited from something that even its own institutional leadership did not see as in its own interest.
A lot of people were displaced because of that initiative. And you really showed two areas, the West End and what happened when it was basically demolished, and also Roxbury. Where did all of those people go?
You know, people still share those stories about some of what it meant to be displaced and how they moved to different parts of the city. And so there's a historic story there about people being shuffled around. That's not unlike the story that we're in now when we talk about affordability and what that means for folks who are being pushed from one part of Dorchester to another, or Roxbury or Hyde Park. That story of displacement because of economic factors is still very much the case. And so I think in the policy world, we'd call this micro migrations. That city's experience based on these sort of economic pain points for families. And so the question is, what does that cost you in terms of the loss of social networks and connectivity? That's something that economists don't factor, but it's something that working class and poor families have experienced for generations. And so people are still moving around the city, Ted, to answer you in a more pointed way. And we're finding folks even having a hard time staying within the city's limits, this is how we're getting the growth of some of our inner suburbs, including Randolph, including Brockton and Stoughton. And so that kind of out-migration is a story that we need to continue to watch because it's worrisome.
We have a number of really interesting questions. I'm going to read one in its entirety because I think it encompasses what a number of people are asking. The idea of seeing residents as planners and local experts and having agency is critically important in moving forward to a more just society. But the challenge that this person has noticed is that through generations of disenfranchisement, it seems to be incredibly difficult to meaningfully engage many long-term residents of the community. How can we best engage these communities authentically through all of the histories, trauma, and conflicts of that are currently ongoing? And I'll just note that I have to disagree a bit in terms of not engaging long-term residents. When I first moved to Boston, I lived very close to where the highway was going to be built. And I was just a young guy in the neighborhood, but I noticed that most of the activists were, in fact, people who had lived in the neighborhoods for a long time and who had a particular sense of being stakeholders in those neighborhoods. And they didn't want to be displaced. And that continues to be the case in a number of our neighborhoods. But particularly given the role that you have now, how do you go about engaging community people to really influence and shape planning policies?
I find I appreciate your reflection on that, particularly thinking about the mix of folks who are at tables pushing for change, or just even pushing for a more engaged civic dialogue. I do feel that in the case here, for me, there is a generation of folks who are very much at the front line of so many social movements that were significant around the country, but certainly here. There's a generation of folks who were really at that front line of kind of really articulating what urban renewal should be, what this anti-highway movement needed to be. I mean, driving the bus for us there, so to speak. And so there's something to be said for folks who are now in their 70s and 80s in terms of a critical generation that needs to be engaged, because so much of what they dreamt of and imagined for us has come to be. And so I do often think about this notion of what I call fight genealogies, which is trying to think about how these different fights have connections between people, between ideals, of so many ideals that we are advancing or talking about now, even in terms of urban change or even climate change. These are not new ideas. They had different terms, different concepts, but they're sort of connected generationally. In my current work, I really feel that the best policies that we have are always produced through heat and confrontation. And so welcome very big tables that disagree, different ages, different races, different orientations, different religions, really having these tables that speak to not only difference, but speak to the shared commonality of trying to get someplace that we want to be, and not taking those voices and those actions out of the rooms of government or bureaucrats like me. You gotta have people who are saying, I disagree. This is messy. Can we do more? Because on the other side of that is how you get the policies that we are most proud of, policies that lead to stopping a highway, policies that lead to different kinds of conversations about inclusionary development or linkage, or new kinds of ideas about contracting or procurement. Much of that has come through fights. And so I'm a little scrappy because I'm from Dorchester, I'm sure, but a lot of how I think about again, policy making or governing has to do with the direct willingness to bring on that confrontation and bringing it to the heart of policy making. That's certainly true for equity, certainly true for any kind of social movements that we speak to and call out as something that we're proud of.
You know, cities and neighborhoods do change over time, and I wonder how you balance the ethics of introducing change into communities when a suburban neighborhood says that they don't want to introduce inclusionary housing. We condemn them and say, oh, that's NIMBYism. You don't want change. You don't want affordable housing in your neighborhood. Right. But when an inner city neighborhood says we don't want change and we don't want new people moving in, we celebrate the collective action that takes place within those inner city neighborhoods and call it a form of community planning to preserve neighborhood values. At one level, it looks like the same thing, but at another level, it's not. So how do you, as a planner, balance the ethics of changing neighborhoods?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I should be offended or complimented that you call me a planner. I'm not a planner. I teach planners and I teach them try to do right. And some of that really is around what we're all trying to get to as a sense of stewardship, a sense of agency, a sense of ownership of cities, of place. Very difficult in cities where people are not owning everything. And I would argue that ownership is not a necessary prerequisite to have a sense of stewardship and pride and connection. And so when you make that distinction, Ted, between cities and suburbs and NIMBYism, a lot of folks will talk about suburban home ownership and the fact that you own you own your home, you own your lawn, you own your car, and you have a right to say what you want and don't want. I think that's a fundamental truism of how we have agreed in this country that ownership, property ownership, a certain possessiveness is as American as apple pie. And yet I would argue that some of this deep sense of possessiveness of land, of space, of people is part of our, more than our Achilles heel, but part of our political toxicity. And so in an urban context, so many of these movements have been about how do you share space, how do you think about a collective vision that is not, again, predicated on a sense of ownership. And so this in this time period, the notion of community control gets at what you're talking about. How much control is too much control? Are you letting someone in? Are you keeping someone out? I think we have to tease into those ideas, but the real question is, how do we get to a sense of collective, of ownership that is really about making sure even the least of us, the least resources, the least wealth, the least political protection or political representation are still able to express the dream of the life that you want for yourself and your children? Is that only predicated on ownership? Is that only predicated on political power? I think we would all say no, but the question is, how do you bring that into being? Some of these are social movements that sort of I referenced, and certainly we could talk about the student movement, the women's movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, were all about really taking on this idea of the government authority or someone else saying what's best for you at a time where so much of what the actions of the state of centralized authority were showing us all that that's not working, whether it meant a highway through your house or being sent to Vietnam or having a president who did not speak in your interest. How could we snatch back the ability to be self-determining, the ability to speak to what we need and what we want? And that's fundamentally the question that you're asking, Ted. And I would say that if our democracy is healthy, if our democracy is doing what it should do, that we are all getting a swing at that.
How do you know when you've had, one person asks, enough community involvement? And I raise that because, as I think a number of people know, I sit on the city's planning board.
Yes, I'm aware.
Right? And,
Yeah.
and there are projects which have gone on for 3 or 4 and sometimes 5 years of community meetings and community engagement. Invariably, the projects get better.
Yeah.
Because of that community engagement. We saw that at a recently approved project in South Boston. We saw it a few weeks ago with the Suffolk Downs project.
Yes.
But the projects go on for years. And for a developer to be able to move forward with something that may have some benefit, eventually the project needs to be brought to closure.
Yep.
So the question is, how do you know that you've had enough community engagement and involvement? And I think that that's going to be a recurring question over the course of this series throughout this semester. When is enough enough?
Yeah, it's a perfect question. It's a little bit of the question needs to be finessed a little bit, because I think the question is, what are the goals? And again, in whose interest are we working here? And so I would say that a prolonged participatory process doesn't necessarily yield anything unless we're clear about what the goals are and whom we're meant to benefit. I would say that in this 1960s moment that I reference, whether it's around the anti-highway fights or this urban renewal battles, planning goes into a crisis, the entire field. And so when Paul Davidoff comes out with his work about participatory advocacy planning and really talking about what it means for folks to be able to advocate and speak to not only their own ideas, but being given the technical assistance and support to articulate these grassroots plans and models to bureaucrats and folks in government, that the idea there was that there was a way to articulate not only a process, but a set of goals. And so I would say that there's got to be a way of calling that out. And I would also call out the city's new move to move forward with the affirmatively furthering fair housing. And now that we can move toward a time where these kinds of provisions are part of the city's zoning code, where developers will have to take into account racial and economic, not only levels, but composition as a way to think about future plans. That there's a way here that what we're saying is that there are particular goals, there are particular outcomes that we just to have in mind in terms of how planning or housing development is having a disproportionate impact on folks who do not have lots of wealth or do not have lots of political power, and historically and even now continue to be marginalized and excluded. And so that is the question for us. And having lots and lots of meetings with folks and lots of dots on Post-its, on maps is not helping anyone unless we have a clear-eyed understanding of what are the goals and benefits that we're trying to bring into focus for folks who continue to be displaced or overlooked or not accounted for. So I'm hopeful that this new zoning provision will allow us to have a much more robust way to think about resetting these tables.
You've taught at MIT, and a question has come in as to how one goes about introducing students, design students and planning students, to the concepts of community engagement, particularly given that in most of our architecture and planning schools, the students there don't begin to look like most of the communities that you're referring to. So how would you begin to engage students in understanding how to work with more diverse communities?
Sure, that's definitely a challenge. Right? We can look at the demographics of planners and architects in America, and I can repeat some of those stats, but I might start crying because they're so depressing. But what I do feel like is a larger issue for me is our preoccupation in planning and in architecture as well with the future. There is this real strong focus on the future, almost like a fictive sense of a projection of time that doesn't have enough understanding and appreciation of the past as also a mode of time. And so what I often say to my students is, as we sit and imagine what this future could be, the speculative fiction of a future that includes none of us, that always seems like everything is possible, let's kind of imagine what that could be, I challenge them by trying to think about the deep past, deeper notions of time that would actually allow them to think about not only the communities that are here now, but were there before, and what do those journeys, what do those intentions, what do those wishes mean for the type of design that we should be leading into. It's a very different way of thinking about population growth or thinking about social impact, but I try to bring, for me, a more robust understanding of time into those considerations, allow us to actually bring time-space models together that look very different. And so this is part of the intervention that I try to make in my classroom and certainly in my scholarship, which is to say, not only who is missing, but when is missing. And what is the when part is quite often the day that was before today and the day before that. And that actually can give you a much more, a fuller story and contextualization of the populations that you're looking at. And you're trying to engage because you can understand what they've been up to, what has been the history of power struggle, what has been the history of migration of this community. And that's a very different way of understanding the political formation of the populations that you're trying to serve. And so I'm asking students to go deeper. and to really come into a fuller appreciation of what is before them in terms of a conversation to bring people into a process. I don't know if that's clear enough to answer your question, but your question is well situated, Ted, because what you're asking is how do we think about people, a much more sort of broader array of people. And I would say we need to do that, but we need to even understand how we come to the conversations of people of the social. And without understanding the politics of social formations, of how people get to where they are, and kind of what that has meant through time, that people that think about space don't have a deep enough understanding of how to come there. And similarly, people that think a lot about time, like historians do, I think there's much more work that they can do to think about space and how time actually influences us that way. And so this is a lot of what you would get in my classroom if you dare to enter. But I think what happens to the students is they come away with a much deeper understanding of thinking about land changes, because of course land and land use changes do not happen in a vacuum, and they do not happen without thinking about time and also the populations that we are charged to serve.
Much of the work in Boston and in other cities that involves planning and design and social equity has been about moving suburbanites from their homes into their jobs in the inner city or in downtown. And one of the questions that has come in is around whether we ought not to think about a priority of moving people across town. As someone who grew up in Dorchester, you know well that it's not that easy to get from much of Dorchester if you are a working person to get from Dorchester into the medical school area where there are a lot of jobs.
Right.
You have to go into town and then come back outside of town. So how does one go about setting the priority that makes a shift from the out-in into something that looks like cutting across
Right.
in ways that serve education and employment and access to a range of other city services?
Sure. And we're already having to answer this question now because so many people are shifting back into the city. As you know, we're still in a moment of population growth, and we're finding that the growth is at the two nodes: folks who are older, who are not interested in living in the suburbs or in some kind of ring area, but are really wanting to see themselves in their golden years and later in the city because of the convenience and amenities, as well as younger people, younger professionals who are finished with school, who want to be in the city. And so that demand on sort of a cultural shift across the country of folks expecting to live in cities is putting all kinds of pressure on older cities like Boston, who are trying to figure out all kinds of new solutions on housing, on work, but really at the crux of this is transportation. So your question, Ted, about how do you move from one part of the city to the next is really underscoring the fact that we have not straightened out our deepest transportation pain points and woes. And so this is necessarily not a great day to get to Stephanie Pollock and make additional demands on our transportation and vision, or the MBTA with Steve Poftak over there. But there's more to say about what is the Boston Transportation Plan 2.0 or 3.0. And so we had this moment in the 80s where we get this new Southwest Corridor, this new Orange Line, kind of extension on the Red Line, some really incredible improvements there. But that was a while ago. And though we celebrate kind of the accessibility of the Fairmont Line, we probably could use more frequency there, and we could talk about what it means to make that line free or what have you. But the question is, how do people get around? And COVID is also bringing into focus where are we getting around to and for what? In this moment where more and more people are working from home and into the foreseeable future will do so, when people need to move around the city, what are those critical actions or those critical trips that need to be highlighted and supported that may not be supported by the MBTA's existing map of trains, buses, and trolleys? And so this is another moment for us to think very critically and carefully about what our transportation needs are even as the T is really dealing with a revenue crisis that's forcing them to think about cutting service. So we saw that just a few weeks ago, and we know how devastating that would be. But it definitely brings into focus for us the need to really rethink our transportation infrastructure for just the question you raised.
We have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that Anne Marie can also jump in. But I'll conclude my questions with a verbatim question from one of our graduate students. With Boston being as diverse and as segregated as it is, what initiatives do you hope to design and implement to create more positive social interactions between Bostonians who so greatly vary based on demographics, race, gender, income, residential neighborhood? How do we get West Roxbury to connect with Roxbury?
Yeah, this is it's a crucial question, and I think again, COVID and the reality of this moment is kind of forcing the point as people feel increasingly isolated and are hungry. I know I am hungry for more and more social interaction. In a city that is so racially and economically fragmented, it puts new demands on us to think about how can we have these touch points. And you can say what you want about Zoom. I've definitely made some new friends in Zoom that I would not have expected. And so I wonder kind of what are the new ways to kind of get people to touch each other. I was looking the other day at this, there's this pen pal project that's happening in Chicago, where different people that have a similar address or something, it could be a similar street name, but different parts of the city, have been matched up by a third party to try to send messages or ways to connect with people. And at first I thought it sounded kind of quirky, but then I looked into it and I was like, how amazing. How do you think about the fact that there's a very particular social and even like a racial ethnic architecture that any city has? And some of it has to do with housing regulations. Some of it has to do with redlining, all these things. And it is very difficult to just disrupt those things overnight. But the question is, well, one, we have to keep hacking away at that. And two, how can you get folks, how can you enable people to have these ways of touching each other in ways that are unexpected? And so that is a question that I have, and I'm wondering about pretty actively, even with the arts and culture team in the city, and also the tourism. We've been working on this new campaign called Visit Boston, which we're hoping to roll out, which is about really celebrating the city's vibrancy in terms of cultural institutions and businesses, and using the fact that we have inside knowledge on places that you like to go for a taco or beer, or you get things fixed and people don't know about that. How can we have more of a conversation there to celebrate these places, to support our small businesses, and eventually roll that into a larger sort of a tourism campaign? And so a very different way to think about tourism, to think about our social and cultural assets, but it's kind of connected to this question about how do you get us to touch each other? How do you make these connective points even more clear, even at a time where we're pulled very far away from each other? So that question is with me. And I'll say this in closing, that even this discussion that we've had about some of the really problematic or controversial statues in the city, I've been thinking about how these conversations, either about the Emancipation Group statue, or some people had some controversies even around the beloved 54th Regiment relief. Is there a way for us to have to allow these difficult pain points, controversies, even our wounds, be an opportunity to kind of come together and think, as opposed to just covering up a statue or taking it down? Or, can there be a way that even what's difficult can be an opportunity for new kinds of conversations, but also building of our social fabric? And so I'm very curious about that, because we have a wounded history, as you know, and there's got to be other ways to think about that than just saying we have a wounded history and it's terrible, or just dismissing it. So these are things that I absolutely think about.
Well, you've raised some fabulous questions that we're going to be covering over the course of this semester, not just in Boston, but in all of the cities where Bruner Awards have been made throughout the country, and that's going to be fascinating. But let me turn this back over to Anne Marie for any other questions or final comments, and also an introduction of next week's session. But personally, let me also thank you for all of the issues that you've raised and your willingness to kick off this semester. Anne Marie?
Thanks so much, Ted. Always a pleasure.
Sure. Thank you, Ted. And thank you, Carolyn. This was fantastic. And I too really appreciate your taking the time and your willingness to frame this topic particularly at this moment, not only for the city of Boston, but also in America. I think it's a time when you referred to the intersection in the 1960s of so many different issues. And I think we find ourselves in similar circumstances right now. And one question I do have for you is given your experience and your various roles as an educator and in the city of Boston, and your view, your understanding, your commentary about the role of history, the importance of understanding history and community engagement. What is your vision for Boston in terms of how we might, think about planning and design in the future in this city?
Yeah, we have a tremendous history in terms of understanding what coalition looks like, what co-governance, what coalition governance even looks like, even to our earliest days. And I feel like the vision of now is for us to lean into this opportunity to pull people together to really think about what the city most needs. We are in a moment of crisis. COVID is teaching us that every day. And even if we are able to move forward with this rollout of the vaccine like we all wish for, and we'll get here faster, we still have problems. We still have folks who are hurting, who are traumatized, who have lost loved ones and continue to struggle in this moment. So the reality of the COVID crisis, the reality of the economic crisis that we're in, and also this moment of racial reckoning is demanding a much bolder approach to understanding the future and rebuilding the future, not in the future, but now. And so much of the work that I'm engaged in is about building out the future of what the city needs to be right now, not for next year or in 10 years, or what is that generational change moment offering us? And that is absolutely what our equity mission is about, is very much trying to figure out what did we learn from COVID, but more of what it has exposed to us. And we've all talked about the disproportionate impact in terms of death, in terms of trauma. And shame on us if we don't take the time to look very, very, very much in the face of this crisis and say, not again, not in this way. What are the things that we need to do to prioritize Black and Latinx populations, immigrant populations, essential workers, to protect our families and children, to inoculate ourselves with a hearty dose of good governing and co-governance so that we can actually be about the future work that the city needs, and also be transformational for even how cities across the country are thinking about what Boston has done. So that is the vision, and that is the urgency right now. And I'm so grateful for all of the Bostonians who continue to take to the streets to make their demands known. And I just want to make sure that there's some way to pull all of that into commitment. So it's not just reflecting and saying this is incredible, but that should deliver us a set of commitments that the government is accountable for. And that many people in the private sector, in the education sector, in the healthcare world, that people need to be put on notice in terms of what we need, and calling out those priorities and making sure that can be delivered in terms of structure, policy, and investment. That's the work.
Thank you. So I think that is a good charge for us and for our series.
Plenty to do. Plenty to do.
And as I mentioned in my introduction, we've lined up a series of sessions on topics with the intention that we begin to engage and catalyze conversations both here in Boston and other cities about the role of design and how it is integral. The role of design of our built environment, our natural environment, is absolutely integral to thinking about how we build just beautiful and resilient cities. So as Ted suggested, just a quick preview of our next week, our next 3 sessions, we'll be focusing on food, education, and engaging and empowering youth. So next week, we'll be joined by Larry Kearns, an architect in Chicago, and Brenda Palms Barber, founder and president of North Landale Employment Network, who'll be talking about Inspiration Kitchens in Chicago, which is one of our Rudy Bruner Award winners, but also a really bold vision to develop Chicago's first food innovation network. So I hope all of you are with us tonight, will join us. And again, Carolyn, thank you so much. It's such an honor to have you with us, and I'm so excited by your vision.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Anything else, Ted?
Thank you all and good night. We look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.